report.
Tonight, an apology from the woman who made that sick ABC film about sodomising minor Gina Reinhardt. What an apology. Wait till you hear it. And where's the ABCs? Also tonight, fighting fake history. I talked to a former serviceman trying to stop the Australian War Memorial honouring what it claims are the frontier wars in which tens of thousands of Aborigines allegedly died fighting settlers. And Pauline Hanson's new law to stop terrorists coming back to Australia. That's also coming up. The Albanese government says we shouldn't even try. An extraordinary development today. But first, talk about politicians behaving badly, allegedly. You know, it's no wonder that people have lost so much respect for politics. First example, although the third and last one is the most important. Federal Labor MP Luke Gosling was today arrested and charged with assaulting the administrator of the Northern Territory, David Connolly, who's like, you know, the governor up there. It's a territory, so it gets a governor. The King's representative, allegedly assaulted by a Labor MP at the Northern Territory's Thailand Grand Festival. Well, Gosling's lawyer was a bit cranky about all that.
It's particularly concerning that in a matter of this type, police resorted to the power of arrest where it could easily have been dealt with on notice to appear or a summons. It's a concern that that might have some political basis behind it. The charge is fully and completely contested, but we're unable to comment any further other than to say we are assisting police with their investigations and will cooperate fully.
It's just amazing. Now, like you just heard, Gosling says is innocent. But the Prime Minister has a real problem here. Is Anthony Albanese now going to make Gosling step aside as his special envoy for defence in Northern Australia until this case is resolved? Other Liberal ministers, Liberal ones, have stood down during inquiries. Wow. But yes, you know, we've got to remember the code, innocent until proven guilty. Example 2, this time from the other side of politics. On Tuesday, sprinter Lachlan Kennedy smashed the Australian record in coming second in the 100-metre sprint at the Commonwealth Games. And Federal Nationals backbencher Lou O'Brien wrote an extraordinary post headed, "White Men Can Sprint." It goes like this. I'll read it to you, and as you listen, you'll hear that it sounds like he was writing, as he was writing, he was thinking, should I actually be saying this? Which is a little voice he shouldn't have ignored. He wrote, It was also encouraging to see a white Australian compete at this level in one of the world's premier sprint events. That observation isn't intended to diminish the extraordinary achievements of black athletes who have dominated elite sprinting for many years. It's simply an acknowledgement that Australians of every background can take pride in seeing someone who reflects their own heritage succeed at the highest levels. There's nothing wrong with being proud of your heritage, whether you're black or white. Pride in who you are is good when it doesn't come at the expense of respect for others. Opposition Leader Angus Taylor today tried to laugh it off.
I congratulate all Australians who are competing for Australia and doing well. We love Australians winning medals. We love Australians succeeding. We always have. That's the country I believe in, and I don't care what their background is. Well, what I make of Mr. O'Brien is, like me, he is supporting Australians to succeed.
Now, it is interesting that Kennedy is the fastest white sprinter, but should all white Australians really be proud as whites? It was only the other day that the same Lou O'Brien had a whack at Pauline Hanson for attacking multiculturalism. You know, that's a government policy to keep us divided into cultural and racial ghettos.
I think we live in a successful multicultural society. I think it's made our nation great.
I think O'Brien, like many Liberals, doesn't seem to realise that this race identification business is exactly what multiculturalism does lead to. People identifying by race, which is a poison. Now, O'Brien might well say, well, you know, what about black pride? You know, what about people saying, I proudly identify as this or that Aboriginal tribe? And yes, sure, that is exactly what is pushing some whites to this white pride nonsense. Let's take pride in a white sprinter. And it's exactly what the left must expect if they push black pride. I mean, action, reaction. That's why I've been against all of this nonsense for years, this tribalism, this my side, your side. And the Liberals, they have got to learn to fight against it as well. Fight this multicultural madness that is dividing us like this. And to my third and last example of politicians behaving badly, throwing your money around like confetti and today laughably dodging responsibility for the waste. In May, when Victoria's Labor Premier was the incompetent Jacinta Allen, the Prime Minister tried to bail out her broke government by promising another $3.6 billion for her insanely expensive and useless suburban rail loop, claiming this was exactly what Melbourne needed. Fantastic plan.
This is a project that will transform the way that Melbourne functions. And what we have as a federal government is $13 billion investing in suburban rail loop.
So much of your money and projects being ripped off by corrupt union officials and organised crime gangs, stealing a reported $15 billion with a B, billion dollars. But don't you worry about that, said Albanese at the time.
How can you be sure this money won't end up in the hand of campers?
Well, there's no place for crime in Australia in any form.
Well, the corruption scandal, in fact, turned out to be a big reason why Jacinta Allen was forced out as Premier this week. And the new Labor Premier is Ben Carroll, and he today made clear that he is thinking of scrapping this at least what he can of this white elephant of a rail project.
I've got no announcements to make today. What I can say is that every dollar of my government will be invested where it delivers the greatest value for Victorians.
All right, that's the background. Today, a miracle from the heavens. Suddenly, Albanese isn't saying this rail project he was giving $13 billion to is just the transformation that Melbourne really needs.
Would you be glad to see it go?
Look, I spoke with Ben Carroll yesterday and I welcome his election as Premier. I look forward to working with him. We'll work constructively with the Victorian government to make sure that the interests of Victorians are looked after.
You see that weave? Whoops, I'm not going there. So last week we had a project that he was saying, oh, this $13 billion, it's money well spent. This week, meh. And here's the funny bit. The person who signs the Albanese government's cheques is Finance Minister Katie Gallagher, who today, and listen carefully for the hints, today was dodging blame and scapegoating Federal Transport Minister Madeleine King instead. I suspect they're not good friends. She did it twice. Listen.
Those corruption concerns were well known when the federal cabinet decided to give extra $3.8 billion to the suburban rail loop in this year's budget. Did you discuss the possibility that some of that money could end up in the hands of organised crime?
Well, this is a matter that Catherine King, as the Infrastructure Minister, has been responding to.
As Finance Minister, risks. Were you concerned, given those stories were well known, the allegations of corruption?
Well, we were very clear through the work that the ERC, through Minister King, that the decision of the federal government in relation to the allocation of funding for that project was for that project, and that appropriate risk management and needed to be undertaken by the Victorian government.
You heard her. Blame Catherine King, everyone. Blame Catherine. Catherine! Katie's just the one who hands over the taxpayers' cash. You can't blame her. I mean, guys, you earn that money and that's how recklessly they spend it. That really is politicians behaving badly. One Nation leader, Pauline Hanson, today presented draft laws to stop terrorists from coming home to Australia, something the Albanese government claims is impossible.
13 men reportedly linked to the terrorist group ISIS are being held in a Baghdad prison and want the Labor government to bring them to Australia. Labor says the law ties its hands, but behind closed doors they have been discussing ways to bring known terrorists and ISIS sympathisers back without the government being seen to help. That is a disgrace. One Nation has drafted a robust bill to keep dangerous foreign terrorist fighters out of Australia.
Hanson's plan is to give the courts a role, which the High Court insists on, when, in granting an exclusion order on a foreign fighter. Then the government can deny them any passport and make it a crime to help them come back. Now, I'm not sure how the courts would grant such an order without hearing from the alleged terrorists, letting them put their side in court. But, maybe it could be done. But Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke today didn't just say, oh, look, no, the High Court's going to say no to this plan. It's going to say no in 30 seconds, he said. Even more extraordinary, Tony Burke said the whole idea was wrong, because if you stopped foreign Australian terrorists from coming home, that could mean other countries would stop taking their criminal citizens back if we kicked them out.
Every country in the world has to take back its own citizens. And I would just say people should be very wary of letting go of the principle that countries have to take their citizens back.
I don't recall the government ever before saying we shouldn't even try to stop Australian terrorists coming back here from, Islamic State fighters. We shouldn't even stop them. I thought they were pretending that they were trying to stop them. Heavens above. Joining me is Chris Merritt, Vice President of the Rule of Law Institute of Australia. Chris, always great to talk to you. Listen, I have not got a constitutional expertise here. You're the man now. Could Pauline Hanson's plan actually work to keep out terrorists? The party claims to have consulted constitutional experts. Do you think the High Court would agree to this?
Well, thank you for having me on, Andrew. There's been a lot of politicking involved in this. Let's get right to the point here. Much of what Pauline Hanson wants to achieve can already be achieved by laws that are already on the books. They're just not being used. The bottom line is what she wants to do is permanently exclude Australians who have conducted themselves in a way that aligns with terrorist groups. We already have temporary exclusion orders that can be used for a period of 2 years and repeated almost indefinitely to effectively achieve much the same thing. She's also proposing to have the government cancel the passports of people who are subject to exclusion orders. That's also possible now, but it's not being used. The Passports Act make that very clear. The other point I'd like to make too is that the fact that these laws are on the books, that we can exclude people temporarily, but with we can repeat those orders, that tells me that Parliament has already decided when it enacted those laws that there's a policy in place in those laws to exclude people, to not take them back. So it's not something brand new. This is the policy of a law that's been on the books for a long time. Now, when Mr Burke says that this proposal wouldn't last 30 seconds, I think he said, in the High Court, I think he's on a bit of a winner there. I think the proposal to permanently exclude Australian citizens from Australia would mean overturning a series of precedents dating back to 1908. So I think the court would be a bit reluctant to do that. But the strength of what Pauline Hanson is trying to do, and it clearly reflects outside legal advice from constitutional experts, is she wants to have the court have a central role in this, the federal court presumably. So that's a step in the right direction. I just don't think the proposal to permanently exclude these people would fly. But bottom line, it's not necessary. All that's necessary is that the existing law should be enforced.
All right, you raised two things for me. One is that it's not clear, and so why not run it past the courts and let them cop the owners, the weight of saying yay or nay to make Australia safe or not. But the other thing is, if we already have laws that can achieve much the same effect, except they have to, you have to renew a temporary ban every 2 years. Why isn't it being used? Does this actually reflect the truth of what Tony Burke essentially said, that he doesn't want them permanently excluded. This is, in fact, a government that does not want to stop them.
I think that's right. I think the fact that these powers have not been exercised, or they've been exercised in one case that I'm aware of quite recently, the woman who was proposing to come back with the ISIS brides, she was subject to a temporary exclusion order. So the power has been used, but very, very sparingly. But look, there's a compromise possible here. There's been some academic criticism about the fact that temporary exclusion orders don't go at the moment to a court. It's the government that effectively makes these orders unilaterally. The strength of what Senator Hanson has proposed is involving the court in making these orders. So my suggestion would be a bit of a compromise and get the temporary exclusion orders run past the court as well. Now that might sound a little bit cumbersome from a government point of view, but it might also prevent some very nasty surprises if ministerial exclusion orders are subsequently overturned and we finish up having to accommodate people who should not be accommodated.
Well, I think you make a point there, because I suspect eventually, if you kept repeating a temporary protection order every 2 years, the High Court would step in and say, now listen, that is in effect you taking a permanent decision without jurisdiction, without the courts having a say, and that is unconstitutional. So maybe I think they should just try the Pauline Hanson gambit and just see if it works. What's there to lose? Chris Merritt, thank you so much for your time. Before the break, we got an apology today, well, kind of, from the woman who made that vile film fantasising about sodomising minor Gina Rinehart, a film the ABC not even just showed on the ABC, but then defended. Now, Race Around the World contestant Kate McGuinness, who made that film, now says, well, the sense of humour featured in each of my films on the Race Around the World program is farcical. In no way was it my intention to promote violence. My writing is cartoonish and always satirical. Unfortunately, jokes do not land with everyone. Its purpose was never to be taken literally. I apologise to anyone I've offended. Now, a couple of things about that. First, why no apology directly to Gina Rinehart, the woman most grievously offended and held up to ridicule? Fantasy of sodomising her, etc. And again, how is that fantasising of her farcical? It was just pure vicious hate. That's all. It was just hate. But the other thing, if even the filmmaker is sorry, brackets, kind of, if even the filmmaker says a public sorry, why hasn't the ABC said sorry too? Why hasn't, in fact, defended it? Defended the film. Oh, no, it's within our guidelines. And why did it ever run this abuse in the first place? Something is sick in the ABC. After the break, the scientists who helped terrify the world about the virus, the COVID virus, and clear China of blame, he even tried to do that, is now put on trial in the US Senate. Well, here's breaking news. Australia's longest-serving climate change minister has quit. Stop the cheering, it's not Chris Bowen. But it is someone just as radical, probably even more so. Lily D'Ambrosio of Victoria, she's been climate change minister since I was a baby, insisting she was even more radical about climate change than the Premier that she loyally served, Jacinta Allen. That tells you something, why Victoria's becoming a basket case too. She's quit because the new Premier is even less interested in that kind of absolute nonsense. He's got a state to save, and she's out, thank heavens. I'm going to tell you now a statistic that should tell you everything about the politicians and health experts who ordered those devastating lockdowns during the COVID crisis. You mean devastating for the economy, devastating for children, devastating emotionally, devastating to any trust that we have in experts. Guess how many Australians died of COVID in May? That's the last month for which we have figures. 66. Now, back during the COVID panic, you know that 66 deaths in a month would have had whole cities locked down. Melbourne was locked down a third time when there were 0 deaths in Australia, in all Australia, in that whole month. But now, old people die. Every death in COVID in May was, in fact, of people aged over 60, 3/4 of them over 80. And like I said from the start, let us protect the elderly. They're the ones that are vulnerable. Almost no one young dies of COVID. Let the young live their lives, which is what got me a blast from Prime Minister Scott Morrison at the time. I was heartless. And now, of course, no one trusts experts. That's been very damaging, including, unfortunately, the real ones. Perhaps the most influential expert in the world at the time was yesterday on trial, so to speak, for allegedly telling monstrous untruths during the COVID scare. Here's Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was Donald Trump's chief medical advisor and also head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And he was being grilled yesterday by US senators and claimed they were so out to get him that he claimed his constitutional right to silence 111 times to protect himself.
Can you explain to the committee why you chose to fund this dangerous research in China?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
Now, as you heard just there, Fauci was grilled on how he had covered up the fact that he had helped fund research by Chinese scientists into making such viruses more deadly. In fact, funded scientists in exactly the lab in Wuhan from which many experts believe that virus escaped. Although Fauci at the time played that theory down as far-fetched, highly unlikely.
Anthony Fauci is shooting down theories that the coronavirus was man-made. He tells National Geographic everything about the stepwise evolution over time strongly indicates that this virus evolved in nature and then jumped species. Fauci added he does not believe another theory that the virus occurred naturally but was accidentally released into the public from a lab in China.
A couple of years later, when the lab theory began to look very much more likely, Fauci was still hanging tough against it.
Just look at the data. A fairly large group of very well-respected evolutionary virologists have examined the epidemiological, virological, geospatial data from Wuhan and have come to the conclusion, not definitively by any means, but feeling that it is much more likely that it is a natural occurrence from an animal to a human. However, since it hasn't been definitively proven, we've got to keep a completely open mind.
Fauci was also blasted for this claim during the COVID panic.
Adverse events are unusual and rare, as a matter of fact, and clearly the benefit of protecting yourself from COVID-19 far outweighs any risk of adverse events.
Now there's so little trust in experts defending the COVID vaccines and conspiracy theories running wild on the internet that Fauci was yesterday attacked like this.
Currently, worldwide, there have been almost 1.7 million adverse events reported to the VAERS system. Of those, over 39,000 were deaths. And of those deaths, 24% occur on the day of vaccination within 1 or 2 days. I published it and people had me on their shows, they would be censored by Facebook.
I mean, settle. In fact, that VAERS system actually says you can't take those reported deaths alone as evidence of a causal association between a vaccine and an adverse event like death, and scientists here have confirmed. When you actually check the deaths that are reported, most often it isn't the vaccine that caused it. Our Therapeutic Goods Administration said of the 976 people who died here after being vaccinated, just 14 were killed by the vaccine, mostly the AstraZeneca one that you remember was withdrawn. Many more lives, in fact, were saved. But who believes experts now, right? Joining me is James Morrow, who hosts the US Report here on News24 on Fridays at 8 p.m. It's covered Fauci's hearing for the Daily Telegraph in a great piece that I urge you to read on the website right now. James Morrow, great to see you again. Fauci was actually given a pardon in advance by former President Joe Biden. So why did he still refuse to give evidence to this Senate hearing?
Well, that's the great mystery here, Andrew, because once you have been given a pardon like this, and there's a Supreme Court case that goes back to 1896 on this, if you're testifying in this sort of forum, and this pardon, by the way, covered the last 10 years of anything, any federal crime that he had committed, right? So if he was asked about anything, he could admit to anything and not get in trouble for this. He instead chose to say that he was invoking his Fifth Amendment rights, which he does not have in that forum. Now, the only thing we can think of is that, either this guy has such an egomaniac, it would be so embarrassing for him to reveal the truth and the dissonance between his diary and what he actually did and said about, everything from masks to lockdowns to the deadliness of the virus, or there's far more sinister stuff that he doesn't want to set himself up in a perjury trap over around who funded the work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology where the virus is thought to have emerged.
So, given all that and him not responding and all that sort of stuff, what actually did we learn from this hearing?
Well, we learned that there's still a lot of anger out there about COVID. That's for one thing. I mean, people, this was a very traumatic 2 years. The whole day was very weird for me, going back and, looking at old clips of things and, everything we went through. And after I put that piece up this morning on the Daily Telegraph website, I got more feedback on that today than I've gotten on anything for a long time. People wanting to tell their stories about how, traumatic the whole thing was, how hard their lives were, what happened to them, and how they were really hurt by the government's response. And I think the thing that we learned is that, there needs to be a reckoning, because we didn't get any reckoning out of Fauci, but some sort of reckoning has to be made for, I think, what everybody went through on the advice of this guy that we know was really spurious.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? In one way, James, I always thought that once we went through all that trauma, most Australians don't want to hear another word about it, right? They don't even want to look Daniel Andrews in the eye, for instance. The Victorian Premier was the most hard line on that. That man is a pariah in Victoria. Unbeaten in election, now that oh my God, don't want to look at him. Don't want him in our golf club. But does it now persuade you, though, the response you got and what you're seeing there, that we do need a Royal Commission into how it was we suffered such devastating lockdowns when the evidence from almost the beginning was this was a virus that was not transmitted out in the open?
And not only that, Andrew, we had a pandemic plan. Tony Abbott authored it when he was health minister, that was on the shelf, ready to go, that did not call for any of the things that they did were so damaging. The lockdowns, the closing of the schools, which was devastating to so many young people. It just destroyed their education, everything else. You ask about a Royal Commission, Andrew, and the thing I would say is this. We're spending a lot of time right now talking about social cohesion. And, we talk about it in the context of multiculturalism and ethnic groups and religion. Fine. But, what else has happened in the last 5-6 years to really harm our social cohesion? I'd say 2 years of being locked up at home and being told to snitch on our neighbors for our own good. I think that as a big root cause for a lot of the angst that we have in society that's now expressing itself in other ways. A Royal Commission would be traumatic, but I also think that letting this fester is toxic.
Look, my wife has to deal with sometimes with children of very poor families who didn't get the socialisation or even the motor skills sometimes from that lockdown. It was just we are living the trauma right now, James. I think it's absolutely disgusting. But, I think the reaction to your piece suggests that people do want some sort of reckoning, don't they?
I would hope so. I think that there's enough people out there, and I think that for the political class to say, oh, well, it's time to move on, let bygones be bygones. you know, we wouldn't let this be bygones if this was something Trump had done. You know, we've got an ICAC hearing about stuff that happened years ago that they're not letting bygones be bygones on. But for some reason, we just say we get a pass on this. It's this expert class that saw COVID as their ticket to power, and they screwed it up royally, and they don't want to be called to account for it, Andrew.
Well, you know it, James. For Melbourne to have gone into its third lockdown with no deaths around the country, and for 66 deaths to have occurred in May, 61 the month before, and nothing, crickets, tells you that we made a terrible, ghastly mistake back then. And no one's been held to account. James Morrow, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. After the break, I'll talk to the ex-soldier fighting the Australian War Memorial's plan to include so-called wars with Aborigines. Fake history, he says. Our Australian War Memorial in Canberra, it was created in law to honour servicemen and servicewomen who died in war for their country, for Australia. But in 2 years' time, the War Memorial will include new exhibits to commemorate Aborigines who died in what it claims were frontier wars against whites, against farmers, settlers, colonial troops. As the director of the War Memorial has put it, it is the memorial's intention to expand on the depiction and presentation of the violence committed against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through an inclusive presentation of frontier conflicts. Now, the War Memorial made this decision immediately after SBS showed a three-part series by activist filmmaker Rachel Perkins 4 years ago, a series hailed by the left media, claiming 100,000 people had died in these so-called frontier wars.
Here in the 1820s, there was a war. It was a small war, but it was part of a much greater war that lasted just over 100 years. But you wouldn't know it because there's no memorials here. And no memorials to the tens of thousands of Australians who lost their lives in the first wars. The nation is silent on the matter.
Of course they've been silent. What's the evidence that these wars and all those deaths, 100,000, actually happened? Peter O'Brien is an author and a former serviceman who's campaigned against what the memorial is doing, and he's gathered 11,000 signatures so far supporting him. He's written why the War Memorial is wrong and why it's acting against its own charter by doing this. He's done that in Quadrant Online. Have a look it up. Great piece. And he joined me earlier. Peter O'Brien, thank you so much for joining me. What is wrong with this idea? Well, let's for a start. Does it actually comply with the law that sets up the War Memorial?
Oh, thank you, Andrew. My belief is that it doesn't. I think that it's operating against its charter as laid out in the Act, and I have sought legal advice with a view to possibly a court challenge. Having said that, I know that the War Memorial Board have also received some legal advice which they are keeping close to their chest. So I suspect that their advice is not fully unequivocal.
Now, was there in fact what can be fairly called a frontier war, or wars plural? Filmmaker Rachel Perkins, the Aboriginal activist, claims there were, and not just that, that claims that 100,000 people died in them, which is a surprise to me. So, frontier wars, were they that, or were they something else?
No, the whole idea of the frontier wars, which they put across as a sort of coordinated effort over many years, in which 100,000 people died, is just ludicrous. That did not happen. Certainly, there was conflict in the frontier, there were skirmishes, and there were atrocities on a small scale. But the overall, and the reason why they are pushing this line is to try to embed the idea that Australia was invaded rather than settled. And although there were skirmishes and conflict, the vast majority of the continent was settled. The Aboriginal people accepted what was happening. They came in and they joined in with what was happening. They were able to see the benefits from it. So, no, there were no frontier wars that we would consider in the modern context of a war.
Well, how would you describe them?
Wherever in the early days, and let's say in the first half of the 19th century, where there were conflict, that was what we would call a police action or aid to the civil power. The military were exercising a function, which is a legitimate function of the Defence Force, called aid to the civil power, and that is not war.
I would have thought too that some of the things that have been dressed up as wars were like raids by some Aboriginal people for food or something, reprisals by farmers. Hardly war. I mean, regrettable, theft on one side, and revenge on the other, self-defence, whatever you want to call it. But war seems to be right over the top.
Yes, that's true. There were acts of brigandage on the part of Aborigines. Oftentimes, the Aboriginal people accepted the fact that there were settlers nearby, and they took advantage of that. They were given food, and were looked after. They were given jobs, but every now and again, the temptation would overcome them, and there would be a spearing of a sheep, for example, which the settlers often dealt with summarily and harshly and illegally in some cases. But they were just isolated incidents. There was no coordination of the sort that we would expect of a war. The Aboriginal people did not have some kind of command structure. They weren't in uniform. They had no discipline. It was just a random series of unfortunate events.
What's been the War Memorial's defence to doing this?
Well, I don't know what the defence is. They seem to have this idea that what happened in the frontier is part of our military history, which it is not, and therefore, if it's part of our military history, it should be covered by the Australian War Memorial. The bottom line is, if there were 100,000 casualties, that's a scale that equates to the world wars, and that equates roughly to the number of Australians who've died on active service since Federation. So what they're trying to do is to say, look at the scale of this war. If we're going to have the War Memorial, then it must include the Aboriginal frontier wars, and that is an absolute sacrilege because it just undermines and devalues, trivialises the sacrifice that over 100,000 Australian men and women have made.
If it's not 100,000, what do you think it is?
Well, the most authoritative source for Aboriginal deaths is the University of Newcastle massacre map that was set up under the late Professor Lyndall Ryan. Now, hundreds of researchers spent thousands of research hours combing through all the records, all the newspapers, all the diaries and so on, and they came up with the figure of 11,000 deaths. Researchers such as Keith Windshuttle, Michael Connor, myself, Roger Carge, have been through various entries in that, and we believe that that figure is exaggerated by a fair amount. But nonetheless, if we accept that it was in that ballpark, that raises the question, how did these researchers miss 90,000 deaths? It's just not believable.
And in fact, Lyndall Ryan's claims have been heavily criticised, as you suggest, exaggerated as well. If people want to join you in resisting this attempt to turn history on its head and feed the guilt and shame complex, what should they do?
Well, the first thing they can do is sign my petition. I started a petition. It now has over 11,000 signatures, and every signature helps. Now, a petition isn't going to change the minds of these unelected bureaucrats. They are unaccountable, but a petition will help. The petition is at change.org, and you just have to look for Hands Off the Australian War Memorial and add your name to it. But I'm asking for more than that. I'm asking for people to get emotionally involved in it as well and to spread the message as far as they possibly can. That's why it would be good if people could read my article and understand all the issues that this comes down to. Last night you interviewed Gary Johns about the new book, Apartheid Australia. I'm a contributor to that book, and that book is not just a series of essays, it's a call to arms, because we need to stop this creeping Aboriginalisation of all aspects of our society, and the War Memorial is merely one of them. People need to become exercised about it, and we need to make it a political issue. So I'm also asking people to talk to their local member and every other avenue that they can think of to raise public awareness.
Peter O'Brien, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Do you know the Australian Electoral Commission is already onto this bandwagon? These things go in waves, don't they? They pick the next cause. This is the next cause. So you recall that a couple of weeks ago, the Electoral Commission renamed the seat of Franklin in Tasmania after what it called the Aboriginal warrior, Tonga Longiter. And it actually has this as the reason for it. Tonga Longiter's leadership during the Black War, so now it's a war, his role in defending country, so he wasn't a bandit, he was defending country, and his enduring significance in Tasmanian history, few people actually know of him, provide strong grounds for recognising his contribution through the naming of an electorate. It's on. It's a war against any pride in this country, and it's a war against history. After the break, bombshell claims that China is sending Iran weapons to fight the US. Just quickly, a very disturbing development in the war in Iran. A Reuters investigation says China is smuggling more weapons to reportedly include up to 400 shoulder-fired missiles, including the QW-12 and the advanced FN-16, which means Iran would be able to not just shoot down planes and helicopters, but even low-flying missiles. Donald Trump says, hang on, China's president told me he wouldn't be arming Iran.
He told me very strongly he wouldn't partake, and he knows I'd be quite disappointed.
Now, to be fair, China and Pakistan both officially denied this story, to which you might say they would, wouldn't they? Meanwhile, the invasion continues. By that I mean the invasion of Britain, of illegal immigrants, taking boats from France with the help of women, in this case, from a British charity, while French soldiers on the French coast just stand on the beach and watch them sail away.
Why have you allowed the migrants into the water? Why haven't you stopped them?
Our order is to let them go like that.
Your order is to let them go?
Now, that man asking the questions of the French police was actually Chris Philp, the Conservatives, the UK Conservatives' Shadow Home Secretary. Joining me from London is Star GB host Patrick Christys. Patrick, always great to see you. Those are extraordinary scenes, and I know you've seen much like you've reported. I think we've run some of your film from the French coast. That way to Britain, boys. And it's just as stupid as watching your supposed border force yesterday acting like a taxi service for boat people that had picked up in the English Channel. What is going on?
Well, in the last 2 days, a French naval ship has fired warning shots at a democratically elected British politician in the Channel. A new illegal migrant route has opened up, setting off 70 miles further south in France than ever before. 1,600 illegals have crossed in the last week. And now the French police are saying that they're under orders not to stop the boats, despite British taxpayers giving them £1 billion worth of our money to actually stop them. You also saw those charity workers there. They seem to almost all be women, which I think is the definition of suicidal empathy, helping to feed, clothe and wave off these illegal men. And of course, sadly, we keep seeing horrific cases in Britain of what some of them do when they get here. And I often wonder how these charity workers feel when they read those news stories. But these illegal migrants and the human traffickers, they're not stupid. They know that there is a new prime minister. They know that he's soft. They know that he might actually let them work without them having been granted asylum yet. And I think we're going to go on now, aren't we, and talk a little bit about the type of people who are actually coming to Britain illegally and how much of a warning that should be to everyone.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, I do wonder about, you said suicidal empathy. Here is one of those people that are coming over in boats, Both Duc Deng, who speaks no English, came illegally from Sudan, where he left his wife and child, so clearly is not fleeing some sort of, for his life. What has he been up to in his new home in Britain?
Oh, absolutely beggars belief. He was denied asylum 3 times. He was given a house, food money. We paid for his legal aid. He then went into a school with a knife, a hammer, a hatchet, and half a jerry can's worth of petrol, having already tried to get into another school. Now, thankfully, it was the school holidays, but I mean, look, realistically, he won't have known that, will he? And he said he just wanted attention because the Home Office wasn't helping him enough. I mean, that's not the way you get attention. Well, I suppose it is the way you get attention, but it's not really the kind of thing that we do here, is it? I mean, this could have been an absolute massacre. It doesn't bear thinking about, does it? What could have happened there? He said that, oh, I just wanted to be allowed to work. Well, I suppose he had a knife with him, so maybe he is a surgeon. He had a hammer with him. Maybe he's an engineer. But he was only sentenced to 2 years in prison for that. But because he's been held on remand until now, he could be out next week. And in terms of the response, nothing. We're almost definitely not going to deport him. I'm sorry, but you have to ask yourself, what on earth is going on here?
I find that absolutely extraordinary. So when you said they're going to let him out any day now, I thought you meant out to Sudan, but stupid me, out in Britain, of course. Look, you mentioned you've got this new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. You said he's soft and soft and soft. But listen, he must read the polls as well. Any sign that he will change anything here, at least, in time for the next election?
What's happening at the moment is because Keir Starmer was such an awful communicator and a very, very kind of cold person, Andy Burnham has come in and he is just more human. So the natural initial human response to Andy Burnham is to go, well, I quite like this guy, or I at least prefer him to the one we had before. So there is a little bit of a bounce in the polls. But the big problem for Andy Burnham is he's not confronting legal or illegal immigration. And the only noises he's making is that he's going to be softer on that. If the numbers keep crossing the channel in the way that they are, and we keep having crimes like we've had as a result of that, at some point he's going to have to tell us what he feels about it. And I suspect that he feels that actually it's not that big a deal. The other problem for Andy Burnham is he's coming out with some nice policies at the moment. Look, we need to do more for adult social care. We need to do more for elderly people when they're in their dotage, who've got dementia and things. Absolutely. Of course we do. But he's not yet answering the questions about how on earth we're going to pay for any of this stuff. For example, we've got too many people going to university in Britain. We need more people to get practical trades. He said that he's going to encourage people to do that. We found out that the way he's going to encourage people to do that is if you are already on benefits as a family and you're telling your child not to go out to work because your family would lose benefits, he's going to give you £4,500 to tell your child to get off their backside and go to work. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't really want to have to pay for that when I just wanted to go out and work myself. So, it'll be a bounce in the polls, but that might dip when the cold, hard reality of who's paying for everything finally kicks in.
It's so strange, Patrick. I mean, we've seen, the rise of the hard left in America now, even in New York, where the Mayor Mamdani is a socialist who's just unveiled the first government-owned supermarkets. Can you believe it? Setting government prices. In Australia, you've got the Greens and the governing party is, again, in this tax and spend stuff. No idea of how to earn it. What on earth has happened where, your guy goes up and the first thing he does is trash Margaret Thatcher, who at least put Britain back on its economic feet?
Yeah, I mean, he said something like, I want to take us back to the 1970s. Well, he forgets the fact that we had rolling electricity blackouts in the 1970s. We seem to have, quite a lot of negativity here, actually. A huge economic decline as well. I think grave diggers went on strike at one point as well, so bodies were piling up. So, look, it's not the kind of halcyon days that many people would have been thinking about. But look, I mean, we're going to have a big stark choice to make in this country. Are we actually seriously a socialist country? And if he wants to do any of this stuff, eventually he's going to have a general election, because you cannot keep announcing things, spending loads of other people's money. We're getting rid of our only space telescope. Our space telescope costs 2.8 million quid a year to run. We spend 5.7 million pounds on illegal immigration.
Well, honestly, Patrick, we've forgotten how socialism does not work. Thank you very much, Patrick Christie's. Coming up next, Sherry Markson. But from me, it's good night.